All set. We're going to get started. Many of you know my name is Gwen Mayer, and I'm the archivist at the Hudson Library and Historical Society. And tonight we have another wonderful author discussion. I want to remind everyone, when you have a question, there's a little box where you can enter your questions down at the bottom. There's also a chat box you can enter things into, or you can post them on Facebook Live with our Facebook discussion, and we will see them and ask the author. Tonight, we have the opportunity to host Gayle Lemmon. Gayle is an author of multiple books, but she also has some other credentials. She's an adjunct senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. I came to know Gayle through her book, Ashley's War, but she's written several books. Ashley's War, in case you have not read it, is about Ashley White of Alliance, Ohio, and it speaks to her life in the military and some of the struggles she had in the United States military. I would highly recommend you read Ashley's War if you feel up to it. And as you drive down toward Alliance, you will find there is a road, one of our state highways is commemorating Ashley's life. Gayle, before we get started on the Daughters of Kobani, would you like to update us on what's going on with Ashley's War?
Yes, for some of you who have been tracking, and I know some of you have written me, Ashley's War is in the process of screen adaptation. Ashley, as you know, is from the area and her family remains there. And really delighted to say Leslie Linka Glatter of Homeland will be directing, and the production will be produced by Reese Witherspoon, and it's at Universal right now.
Well, I think I really am looking forward to that. But tonight we're going to talk about the Daughters of Kobani, which is your newest publication. It certainly centers around Syria, but I think I'm going to let you explain sort of an overview of it to everybody.
The Daughters of Kobani is really about the women who fought ISIS, and not just against ISIS, but for women's equality. And it really is a kind of David versus Goliath story of the women who fought to hand ISIS its first defeat as America's on-the-ground partner in the fight against the Islamic State. Only David is also a woman in this case. And so I saw this, actually, Ashley's War has a direct tie to this story in that one of the soldiers who's part of the Ashley's War story called me from Syria in 2016 and said, "You have to come see what is going on in Syria. It's absolutely amazing because women are leading the fight against ISIS, and they have the full respect, not just of the men that they're leading, but also of the U.S. service members, the U.S. Special Operations soldiers who've really come of age in these post 9/11 wars, and who say that this partner force is full of warriors for whom they have enormous respect, and that very much includes the women." And so I really wanted to understand how this very far-reaching experiment in women's equality came to take place right on the ashes of the ISIS fight, brought to you by women who fought the Islamic State room by room and house by house and town by town since 2014.
Can you explain the importance of Abdullah, and I'm going to butcher his name here, but Abdullah Öcalan?
Öcalan, yeah.
So, to these young women?
So Abdullah Öcalan is this kind of larger than life political figure who depends on how you see him, depends on where you sit. For Turkey, he is considered a terrorist because he led basically a Kurdish liberation movement because the Kurds as an ethnic minority could not practice their holidays, name their babies what they wish, publish books in their own language. And so he started this movement. Now, decades later, he ended up in jail in Turkey, but his whole mindset changed from violence to preaching kind of grassroots participatory democracy. Think something like to the left of Bernie Sanders, truly, with no hierarchy and environmental awareness right at its center, and Kurdish minority self-rule with women at the center. So the women in this story who fought ISIS, they were really moved by Öcalan's statement that the Kurds couldn't be free until women were free. And he talked about the housewifeization of women's work and how women's work over the decades had been reduced to cleaning and cooking and taking care of the household, when really women were capable of so much more. And so by the time ISIS comes, which is this fighting force, which truly had at its core enslaving women, trafficking of people, the subjugation and violence that is truly a crime against humanity, by the time they come to the fore, they somehow, in this kind of Shakespearean showdown, find themselves facing off against this fighting force that refuses to back down, that has women at its center, and not just women, but women with women's emancipation and women's equality right at the core of who they are.
How old are these these ladies?
Yeah. So I would say anywhere from 17. At the beginning, there were much younger fighters, and then they signed since an accord. This is no child soldiers, but there were 16, 17, 18 upward all the way to, let's say, late 30s, early 40s, because the Islamic State starts to pose an existential threat to the Kurdish community. And you have to think about this. 2014, I don't know if you all remember the slick videos that ISIS was putting on, the threats to the United States. The time that this story starts, ISIS had never had a defeat. And the Americans play a huge role in this story, because these women come to the global stage because the Americans need a partner on the ground that is willing to fight ISIS, willing to die fighting ISIS, willing to sacrifice their young people to do this without toppling the Assad regime in the Syrian civil war, because the US had no appetite for regime change at that point. And the Obama White House definitely did not feel that it had been elected to start wars in the Middle East. It felt it had been elected to end wars in the Middle East. And so it's looking for the fighting force that has the heart and the gumption to stop ISIS without taking down the government. And these women really capture the world's imagination in this kind of, David versus Goliath showdown that happens in 2014. And from that moment, from that first battlefield loss they hand ISIS, they go on to fight alongside the US as America's ground force for a half decade.
Gayle, I can imagine in other countries that there would be young women passionate enough to fight for their freedom or for their country. What really struck me was how these women coped with their families as well as their decisions and actions. You profile probably 7 or 8 women. Can you sort of give us an overview about how they dealt with their families as well as dealing with everyday war?
Yeah. So, I mean, my own family is from the region. So I was particularly captivated by the journeys they had taken, right? If we go from, Rojda, we meet, who as a girl in visiting her grandmother's village, her uncle dresses up in a white sheet. So he scares them to be a ghost out of playing soccer, because girls bring shame on their family by playing soccer at this time in a village, in a very traditional place. Znareen, another young woman who ends up fighting ISIS, as a teenager, her parents say no to university study because her uncle forbids it. That's not what women in the family do. Or she tries to marry someone she loves, and her uncle again forbids it and says, listen, this is, I've already chosen a husband for you. And she says, no, if I'm not going to marry the person I love, I'm never going to marry. And then when she gets a knock on the door from this group saying, we're arguing for women's equality, come join us, she does, right? And then we see Nowruz, who ends up being the commander who leads all of these women in battle. And her mother was illiterate, never got to go to school. And she says, don't be like me. Have a life where you have choices and agency. And she ends up going on her own journey to lead women and men in battle. And all of these women become the Americans' interlocutors on the ground in the fight against ISIS. And I spent a lot of time with US Special Operations soldiers who had never worked with women in a partner force. And one of them, who'd done, 13 or 14 deployments in the post 9/11 conflict, said to me, Gayle, at first I wasn't sure how I felt about having women in the partner force. I didn't know if it would be different. But then you start working with them and the warrior ethos is the same. And at the end, actually, he wanted his daughters to be like them. He wanted his daughters to have their courage, their heart, their conviction. And I thought that was just so deeply moving. I wanted people to know that.
Can you speak a little about how the Americans partnered with these young ladies?
Sure. The Americans have learned, by 2014, the Americans are working to learn the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan. And Joe Biden, as vice president, now as president, President Biden, really talks about counterterrorism plus, where you'd have this notion of a very light US footprint on the ground, American air power, and then local forces really taking the fight in terms of the lead, right? So this is exactly what you saw play out. And this was what we call a by, with, and through in national security, jargon, right? Which is that you work with and you achieve your objectives through local partners on the ground. And think about this. These folks start working with, and really the book takes readers into the Americans' hunt for a partner. They're looking around and they're looking for this Goldilocks that will take the fight to ISIS, but not topple Assad. And that becomes the quest for the Americans. And they're watching from overhead the kind of little force that could, this group of folks who have less weapons than their enemies. They're low on ammunition. They're low on people. They're low on food, but they have will. And the Americans say the thing that you can't recreate is the desire to fight and the ability to have your will win out. And so that ends up being the thing that the Americans note, that not only is this fighting force, with women very much a part of it, taking terrain, but it's keeping terrain and advancing. And there's a moment in the story where there's someone eventually calling in a U.S. airstrike in the fight for Kobani. And he actually calls it and says, destroy my house, right? Destroy my house because ISIS is there. And then there's another moment where they get called in airstrike and there's a woman there who the Americans say, oh my gosh, you're too close to where the ordinance is going to fall. You shouldn't be there. And she has her hand over her ear and said, no, because the closer I am, that means the faster I can advance and take that territory back from ISIS. And there's a moment in the book where actually U.S. military folks start sleeping at their base and their wives are delivering Chick-fil-A to them at their base, because what they find is that this fighting force has such a heart and such a will that they want to support them with everything that they have. And I think that starts this 5-year relationship that ends up with the Americans saying this is the finest fighting force that we could have to fight the Islamic State.
Syria is a very convoluted civil war, and certainly it's almost a regional proxy battle in some ways. Do these women become involved with the international political aspect, or is their focus simply local and their own freedom?
I would say that politics is really the focus of these women. What they're focused on, though, is self-rule. So this embattled minority that truly could not teach its kids in its language, name its children what it wished, publish, celebrate its holidays, right? Before the Civil War, all of a sudden, the chaos of the Civil War creates an opening for those who are organized to say, okay, this is how it's going to work now. The Assad regime is gone. We're going to take care of our neighborhood. Just imagine if there's no state right now, you're taking care of your block of alliance or your couple of blocks. And that's really what happened. So these folks said, what we're focused on is governing ourselves with our rights at the center of it and with participatory democracy, kind of New England style town hall participatory democracy right at the center. And women will be a huge part of the politics. So every town we take from ISIS, every town we govern, we'll have a co-head who's a woman and a co-head who's a man. Every town will have a women's council. Every town will have women judges that will decide domestic cases or cases that affect women. Our founding document will say yes to girls' education, no to child marriage, no to dowry, yes to full equal rights. Think the ERA in this country, which we're still struggling to see whether it advances. All that politics was local, but it infused their sense of purpose. That is why, when you talk about why they were willing to stand up to ISIS, there were two reasons. One is they said you cannot have a world in which women can be bought and sold. You cannot let stand what ISIS is doing to women. Secondly, women have to stand up for themselves. They have to say, these are our rights. We're actually not asking for them. We're going to tell you that they were God-given, and this is how we're going to advance. And so the politics piece is very much a part of it, but really focused on self-rule.
What about the most recent political regime in the United States? How did they stand by or abandon these young ladies?
So, I mean, the book is very straight. I hope people really will spend time with these women. That, you know, the book is very straight about the hunt for a Syria policy across 2 administrations. And the book ends with this moment where U.S. forces withdraw fairly quickly and unexpectedly after Turkey launches an incursion into this territory. And so we watch as the people who fought ISIS alongside the United States now go back to the same towns where they stood with the Americans to liberate from ISIS and face a NATO ally on their own.
Do these women remind you of women in other engagements?
I truly believe so. I was raised in a community of single moms. I do every library event because I grew up in Greenbelt, Maryland, going to the public library. My mom always limited the number of books I was allowed to take because I would take so many out at a time. And I think that my obsession with telling stories like this, Dressmaker of Karkhana, my first book, was about a teenage girl whose business supported her family under the Taliban. So all these girls who were breadwinners during years they couldn't be on their own streets. Ashley's War, a story of an all-women special operations team that was recruited for Army Ranger and Navy SEAL missions while women were officially banned from ground combat. Daughters of Kobani, the untold story of women who said the Islamic State and what it does to women will not stand, and we are going to build a future that looks different for the next generation, and we're going to lead from the front as snipers and commanders, not because we love war, but because we love peace and because we want the next generation of girls to know we stood for them. And all of these stories really are about communities of women underestimated from the outside, who rise to a cause greater than themselves in answer to a moment that demands more of us. They are not people who were born superheroes or different than you and me. They were people who found what they needed to in the moment to be of service. And yes, those I think are the ideas that really fascinate me, that resilience, that courage, that spirit, that love. And the fact is, we still don't see women's stories as universal. We still see a story that has 2 or more characters that happen to be female as a women's story. And part of the quest of telling these stories is to show people that these have real heft and importance to every one of us.
Let's talk about you. You had to learn multiple languages and go in dangerous places and spend a great deal of time away from your own family in order to write this, didn't you?
I did, and it's a privilege. I mean, it's a privilege for those of us who are blessed to be able to tell stories that move people. It's a risk you think about constantly, and it's also a privilege because, you know, my mom passed when I was 13, and I think it really gave me the sense that you must make each day count, and it made me feel, I think, even more importantly, that you want the work to matter and to matter far beyond people you will meet in your lifetime, right? To move people. And I say that the thing that moves me most is 2 days ago, I got a message from a U.S. Special Operations soldier who just sent me a text that said, thank you, both on my behalf and on theirs, because I worked with these amazing women and I was always worried nobody would know them. And actually General Votel, who was the Central Command commander, CENTCOM commander at the time, read the book in 2 days and sent me this beautiful blurb that said, endorsement in book jargon, that said, you know, I had always worried that our Syrian Kurdish partners would not receive credit for the valor that they showed. And this book captures it perfectly. So to know that your story captures that is moving.
Have any of these young ladies developed a voice larger than their local fight? I mean, are they speaking out in the world stage about what's happening?
They have, but honestly, they've been fighting ISIS for the rest of us. They're really busy. And the second thing is, where they also have a lot in common with the people of Ashley's war, is that they didn't think they did anything extraordinary. They weren't eager to talk to me at all. They were happy to when I would sit down, but they'd say, "Oh, Gayle, how many more interviews are you going to do? You asked me the same question 7 times across 4 different interviews," because book interviews are really tedious, right? I mean, you're in the weeds, like, tell me, where were you standing when this happened? And what were you eating for lunch? And people are just like, oh, come on, I'm done with it already. So yes, they very much, I think, feel very strongly about it. But I think what I wanted to do was to just bring readers in with a flashlight. My job isn't to share my politics with you. We have enough of that in this country at the moment. My job is really to hand a flashlight and say, come into this world and meet these people who've done pretty extraordinary things on America's behalf. And you can decide what you think.
Talk a little bit about these young ladies and their adaptability to technology and the way they harness technology.
So interesting. So we had this moment when we were there for PBS NewsHour, and it was so wild because I'm watching, 6 young women sitting around a screen kind of looking at this thing. And I think I'm so obnoxious, but I'm going to tell you how embarrassing what I thought was. So in full disclosure, here it is, because we're live. So I'll be candid with you, because I love libraries and I feel like, why not tonight? But I thought, oh my gosh, are they on Facebook? What are they doing? Well, it turns out they're on Google Earth, taking calls in from what they'd just seen on the field and basically mapping out US airstrikes with the Americans, obviously with a great deal of awareness as to where civilians were and a great deal of care. And, in a situation, it was so hard, because I think what people don't appreciate is the inhumanity of what they were facing. The men of ISIS would mine everything. Kitchen, if they were leaving a neighborhood, they would put explosives in teapots, in doors, and they would use cars as explosives to target. They would strap grenades to drones and go target these women. And then they would get on the radio and say, hey, we're going to come rape you. We're going to come enslave you. And their job was to stay above it and focus on the fight. And I just wanted people to see that. And there was a funny moment where I asked one of the commanders, did you ever feel like I feel like if somebody said that on the radio, the first thing I'd want to do is get back there and answer. And she said, no, we knew better than to answer. But the younger people would get very irritated. And so the younger fighters would sometimes take the walkie-talkie and go right back at the ISIS fighters and say, oh yeah, you're such a man, come show us where you are. And sometimes they actually would.
You asked me before we started this interview how COVID has affected library world. Has COVID affected the battlefield for these young ladies?
I think ISIS, there's a lot going on. So in some ways, yes. But in some ways, ISIS has really used it to regroup. The fact that there are fewer people able to be out and about and patrolling. So ISIS has used it. I wrote a piece for CNN at the very beginning of COVID, what feels like a very long time ago, about ISIS using COVID to its advantage. And I think we continue to see that. But I think for a lot of these folks, life hasn't changed a great deal.
Today, it occurred to me that the United States is nearing 500,000 deaths because of the virus. Isn't that approximately how many people now have died in the Syrian conflict as well?
More than. In fact, the UN stopped counting. Syria is let me just take a step back. I'm so proud of bringing this story to readers because I do think it's a great source of inspiration. Readers write me and say, wow, I never thought I would actually read a story about the Syrian civil war and feel inspired and feel like I could, do more than I thought I could going in. But I will say Syria as a whole is the war that has extinguished the power of adjectives to describe its horrors and shown just how helpless the international community truly is. No one has effectively intervened to stop the deaths. And I really wanted readers to go into this book and realize the Syrian civil war started as a very peaceful, democratic protest by young people who just wanted to be able to choose their government and express themselves. And it has been met with unceasing violence by the Syrian regime. And it has become the playground for international extremists who have used it to further their ends. And it's a tragedy. I'm very dear friends with an incredible young woman who is now in London, who was part of a young group of young people who just started putting news on Facebook when the Syrian civil war started. And almost every one of her friends has either been killed or disappeared.
It's such a powerful book to read. So I want to get to some of the questions from our audience. And someone asked what you meant when you were on the news hour tonight about the women's connection to a terrorist group.
Oh,
He
yeah.
thought that you were referring to the PKK.
So this was how, this is a real fine line of policy that the United States has been walking. Okay, and the book goes into this at length, as you and I were talking about, Gwen, because I really wanted readers to understand the complexity of what U.S. officials were facing. So this ISIS is on a tear, and they've taken town after town after town. U.S. military folks, U.S. and diplomatic folks are deeply concerned. They are worried about what it is going to mean for the United States to have this group go unchecked that is talking about attacking in the US and Europe and well beyond. So enter the Syrian Kurds, who, as the book traces, they do take their ideas from Abdullah Öcalan, but they are not directly linked according to US law. They're an offshoot of the PKK, but not directly linked to it, right? And that's what US State Department law is now. That's why the US could directly arm this group of Syrian Kurds, because legally the US found that there was absolutely a distinction. Turkey makes no distinction between the two, and the US has always said, these folks have launched no attacks from their terrain, and I urge you all to read at the back of the book the memo from Ambassador William Roebuck, who writes it after the Turkish-backed incursion. He writes this very beautifully written memo about how the US, by working with this Syrian Kurdish force, put a target on its back. By raising its profile, by helping it, kind of capture the world stage and the world's imagination, has made it the target of Turkey. And so US policy has walked this fine line and continues to, saying that the Syrian Kurds who follow Öcalan are not the same as the PKK.
Are you still in contact with these young ladies?
I am.
How do they feel about their stories coming to light?
I mean, I have talked to them throughout. I think it's very moving for them to realize that America actually is inspired by, cares about, is really fascinated by who they are. And that it's important for people to know that this fighting force, not just the Syrian Kurds, but Syrian Kurds playing a huge role in it, took 10,000 losses in the fight against the Islamic State. And as you know from Ashley's War, every Gold Star family is a tragedy. But to get rid of ISIS holding territory the size of the UK, or certainly a swath of it, and a chunk of that was in Syria, the US in Syria had fewer than 10 combat deaths. And the Islamic State lost its territorial caliphate because these women and the men they fought alongside were willing to go room by room and house by house and town by town to fight ISIS. And it was a brutal fight. And they did it not just for themselves, but for you and for me and for all of us to be safer.
Do these young women, you've got to get tired of battle day after day, year after year.
Yeah.
And, dig deep to find the motivation to keep doing this for future generations. And have any of them, I don't want to be tempted to leave, but there were several times it seemed like the characters had been injured and could have, walked away from this, and yet they returned back again.
Yeah.
Do they envision a life beyond fighting? Do they want to fall in love and get married and have a family, or
I think there's a two-part answer to your question. One is, I think everybody who is on this conversation who's served will understand why they felt the way they did. They didn't want to go to war. but they wanted to make sure their people were taken care of. And what motivated them was to stand up to the ideas of the Islamic State and simply to protect their towns, their homes, their neighborhoods. They are not so different from in fact, at all, from the women you and I know who will do anything to protect their families, their communities, their neighborhoods, their towns, right? You have women you know in your family, right? In your neighborhood who would do the same thing. And so I wanted to show that the reason why, so I'll tell you the story about Azima, and then I'll tell you one other story. So Azima is kind of this larger than life woman who the Americans, before I even arrived in Syria, said, you have to meet her. She is this kind of swashbuckling, chain smoking, joke telling character who you want to spend time around if you meet, who is a leader that her fighters love because she never asked them to do anything that she wouldn't do herself. She leads from the front. And she, ISIS in Kobani, as we follow her in the book, ISIS grazes her with a bullet. They shoot her, and she basically finds her way to make her way out of bed to the press conference at the end of the battle for Kobani, which is this very dramatic David versus Goliath showdown in which, as we talked about, right, David is also a woman. And she stands in front of the cameras and says, women have been part of leading this force to victory. And I want you to know that. She still has a bullet close to her heart at the time, but it's important to her for all the women who were lost and for all the men who lost with their teams to show who it was that handed the first defeat to the Islamic State with American air power from the sky, but this fighting force on the ground. And when her family says, please take a break, okay, we've had enough of this, come home. She said, no, my job is here with my team. And I wanted people to understand that it was love of her people, love of her family, love of her community that drove her to do that. And then the next story, just to answer your question, final story is this, is that Nowruz, who's the head of the Women's Protection Unit, I asked her that after the Turkish-backed incursion, after a very difficult set of weeks, and she also had just lost her father. We sat in a cup of tea and it was pouring rain outside. And I said to her, did you ever think of a different life? And she looked at me and she said, I love children, but all the fighting we've done is for our nieces and nephews. It's for our next generation, so that they live in freedom, so that they have liberty, so that they can practice their holidays and name their children and go to school in their language, and so that they will never face a fighting force like the Islamic State. And I want them to know that we did it for them.
One library patron wants to know if you ever felt your own life was in danger.
I think what's remarkable is that there is a very fragile stability that they have effectively put in place that really looks very different than anything else the United States has done in the post 9/11 conflicts. Because all throughout, every time I went 7 times. 2018, I was there every quarter, and you never saw the Americans. The U.S. forces were like the Oz-like presence hanging over northeastern Syria, keeping everybody kind of on side, but it was only local forces that you saw. And the thing that was actually your biggest enemy was complacency, because it all felt so normal. You get your coffee and in the morning, and you go get your, snacks at night. And yes, of course there was war and tragedy, but also there was just this amazing spirit, which I think those of you in Ohio will understand, of just getting on with it. I remember going into Raqqa after ISIS, and I met this amazing teacher who said that as soon as they came back, when ISIS was gone, her father said, you must go to your school and rebuild. That's the most important thing you can do now. And I think it's that spirit that I really wanted this book to do justice to.
Mary wants to know about their military training. What kind of military training did these young ladies get? Are they continuing? Is it organized? Is it...
So at the beginning, they had, kind of basic tactics training. And you see that in the beginning of the book, right? You kind of follow them through it. And then, honestly, the battlefield becomes their teacher. And the Americans, John Spencer from West Point is a dear friend. And we talk a lot about urban combat and how this becomes a textbook study in urban combat, both Kobani and then Raqqa, and so much of ISIS because of what ISIS did. Because it would also take people as hostages. I mean, can you imagine taking moms and dads as hostages on the way out so that the folks who are trying to fight ISIS can't attack without also harming civilians, which is the last thing they want to do. And so, that's why the beginning of the book, the quote is, the best revenge is not to be like your enemy. And those of you who love books will know that's Marcus Aurelius. And that military training they get in combat becomes the reason for the book's title. The Daughters of Kobani is because these group of women came out of that battle for Kobani, different people than they entered. And they used that training to fight ISIS and to take the fight to the Islamic State, not just for their sake, but really for ours.
I heard through the grapevine that this might have been optioned for a TV series.
That's correct.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So this was optioned by Hidden Light with Secretary Clinton, Chelsea Clinton, Richard Branson's son, Sam Branson, who is an entrepreneur. And truly, I'm so excited because the thing is that when people trust you with their story, your job is to put it before as many people as possible. And as we were just talking about, when none of the people in this story thought they did anything extraordinary on the Syrian side or the American military side, who play a huge role in the story that's woven through. And actually, they were probably the biggest advocates for me telling this story, were US soldiers who said, we worked with these women, you must get this right and you must tell this story because it cannot be lost to history. And so to me, I want it to be personal for everybody. I want everyone to know these women. I want everyone to spend time and see their humor. There's a scene that I love so much. It's in the book where Rojda, who's a very dutiful daughter, right? Also loves Maradona and Brazilian soccer, right? She gets a big reader. She gets a call in the middle of the battle for Kobani from her mother. And some of you might have family members like this who are going to call no matter what, right? You can tell them not to call, but that is not a suggestion they take personally. And she told her mother, I'll call you when I can, but moms are moms. So if she doesn't answer, her mother will just keep calling or will think that she's dead. So instead, she picks it up in a split-second decision. And because she can't answer because bullets are whizzing by her, she just holds up the phone. And her mother hears all the bullets going by and just starts crying, oh my God, what are you doing? And she realizes she's made a mistake, but she had no choice. So showing that humanity amid inhumanity and the role of technology, the role of cell phones in war. I really want everyone to feel the immediacy of that. And that's what the screen does.
Let me see what else we have for another question. Someone wants to know about the young ladies today. Are they still fighting?
So they are, and they're also really trying to protect their gains. I was there in December of 2019 and would have been back in 2020 were it not for COVID. And the thing that was remarkable is that within like an hour and a half, it's almost like Star Wars. You see Syrian regime convoys, you see Russian convoys, and then you see US military convoys. And you think this is a non-state actor, right? The Syrian Democratic Forces, of whom these women are a part, that has real nation state problems. Let's not forget, these folks are still holding more than 2,000 ISIS fighters that no one will take back. And they're doing it for the world. The Americans asked them to, even when they were facing the Turkish-backed incursion, they continued to hold these folks and not let them free, even while they were defending their own families. And so I just wanted people to understand that they really believe that what they're doing matters. And they have worked with a lot of Americans who've continued to be in touch with them, who worked with them saying, please, know that we appreciate deeply what you've done in the sacrifice. And I think, what is remarkable is to see is that the governance project that they have set up continues to exist in all the towns that they still control, even ones where Russia is very active.
How are they recruiting the next generation, or are they?
So I think that is, it's a great question. I think there's so many women, I think this force is smaller, obviously it was, than when they fought ISIS and when they were fighting them. But one of the things the book really talks about is television and WhatsApp and YouTube and Facebook and watching these women and what it meant, right? Families that would never have let their daughters join this fight were watching as it was young women who were protecting their communities. And that power of seeing it on a screen, I think really changed perceptions dramatically.
Wow. It's quite a story, Gayle. So thank you for writing it for us. Let me see what else we have for questions. It's just so fascinating. Do you feel like the United States has let them down?
You know, I joke very regularly that I have much more hope in northeastern Syria than in northwest Washington, because the spirit of getting on with it and kind of not dwelling on your, what your setbacks have been is very real. That said, I think they have great hope for the future. That President Biden this last week said the U.S. is going to continue to keep the pressure on the Islamic State. And this is the partner that has done that, has been America's ground force in that effort. And so I think they are cautiously awaiting an understanding of what this administration sees as the future of its presence in the region. And it's very important to know the U.S. presence is in the hundreds. You're not talking about any kind of large force, but it is enabling them to keep a kind of balance of power and to keep the gains that they've made in the name of self-rule and really what they would call grassroots participatory democracy.
Do you imagine that any one of them will go on to be a national leader?
I think they already have been leaders in their area. The question is what happens with the Syrian civil war? What they really want is a say in their nation's future and the ability to govern themselves. And that is, as I write in the book, the ending of this story has always been written in invisible ink that no one can yet decipher.
You have to wonder when these young women become in their 60s and their 70s, how they're going to communicate all of this to their daughters or granddaughters. Do they think about that?
I think that was why, even when they were just, come on, Gayle, how many more questions do you have with me? I think they did want it captured. And actually, it was very similar with Ashley's War. None of the young women in Ashley's War thought they did anything special, but they would talk to me because of their friends. And that is the same here. They didn't think they had done anything extraordinary. I did, but they wanted me to know how brave their friends had been, especially the friends they had lost. And I am deeply gratified to know that it's going to be published in local language shortly by a local publishing house. And yeah, that means a great deal.
I see one more question just popped in. What is the age range of the women who are committed to this cause?
Yeah, I think, 19-ish to 40-ish. And as Nowruz, who's one of the heads of the Women's Protection Unit, said, many will come for some time and then go off and get family. Interestingly, maybe for this audience too, is a fascinating set of interviews I did with the Christian community, where there are mothers who will come in and rotate in the women's protection units there, because ISIS really targeted Christians who were practicing their faith, and they kidnapped more than 200 Christians from the Khabur Valley. And I spent the day with a young woman from the Christian community who said at the beginning, when she went to the women's protection, to the all women Christian force that she was part of, her family was deeply opposed. And then every week at church, people would come up to them and say, "We're so proud of your daughter. She's protecting our community." And watching her defend, their neighborhoods, their houses of worship from the Islamic State, I think they really were changed. And she's also in law school. So I think she'll have quite an amazing story to tell.
Well, that's a great place to say that Edward thinks this is one of the most inspiring stories he's heard of or read, and he's definitely going to read the book. And he said, thank you. Which brings us to the next question. What part of the world are you headed to next?
Oh my gosh. I got to tell you, I I never have a good answer when people say, what is your next book? I was working on a book about the community of single mothers that raised me when this story surfaced, as you'll see in the prologue to the Daughters of Kobani. So my answer is I have to do justice to the trust people placed in me with this story. And I ask all of you to share it with other people, because people who really did America's work as America's partner form the backbone and the heart of this story. And it's why US folks who almost never speak with storytellers talk to me so much about what these women had done, is because it really had an impact that we had never seen on how you and I appreciate our freedoms and our safety. So I would ask all of your help in sharing this story with others. And that is my focus for the moment.
Gayle, do you equate their battle to anything else in history?
You know, I mean, I think you always have underdog fights that capture your imagination. And I think that was one of the questions I wanted to leave readers with was, what does this make you think of? You know, I've had folks from the US write me to say that it made them think of, the Americans' quest for freedom, right? Or practice in, their holidays, or to just run their own affairs. And then I've had others who say, this reminds me of places much farther away. So I really do hope people ask themselves that question. I deeply believe as an author, your job is to pose the questions and take people into the world. And I hope that people really do think as they read this.
I think you have done a wonderful job at doing that. You made my eyes open a great deal about the struggles and triumphs of these young women. There is a question out there from Sigrid, who wants to know if these young ladies will be lauded by their own society.
They already are, is the short answer. I mean, I think that it's hard to imagine how challenging it is to get even to northeastern Syria, right? But there's a very vibrant local media that has been very clear about who it was that led to victory against ISIS. And there are billboards, you'll see in the book, there are roadside signs that show these women. And one thing I thought was so fascinating, and actually something that I would love us to think about in the United States, is that for all those women and men lost in battle in northeastern Syria, their photos are on lampposts and on street signs. So as you drive down the street, and you'll see this in the book, so you'll see the photos in the book, you can't help but remember how much sacrifice was made in your name. And I always think about, in this country, less than 1% of this country has fought 100% of its wars for 2 decades, with most of the rest of us being able to go on just fine as if it weren't happening. And I personally do not think that's okay. And I think I really deeply appreciated the fact that this society had decided to honor and keep front and center the young women and the young men who were lost, protecting it.
Just one more question.
Sure.
What would Ashley think of all of this?
Oh, I thought, it's very moving that you asked me this. I feel like I got to spend so much time with her when I was working on Ashley's War. And I spent so much time with people whose lives were changed by how she lived, by who she was, by her heart, by her kindness, by her goodness, and by her grit and her fortitude. And it meant so much to me, actually, that it was young women that she served with who were the ones who called me and basically forced me to write this book, because it was one of the soldiers who was part of the story who said, you have to write this. And I said, no, I'm not going to do this again. War has overtaken my life. I'm going to do something like, very domestic. And I just knew the minute I saw those women and what they were up against, and what they were sacrificing, and also just their spirit of courage and heart and humor and friendship, that they reminded me so much of the young women I'd met in Ashley's War in such a different way, but with the same foundations of why they were doing what they did and what they were facing, and their spirit of sisterhood. So I hope she would enjoy, and I hope she'd be proud of it.
I would imagine she would, especially when her friends are the ones that are calling you. So thank you so much, Gayle. I want to remind everybody, her book is available both at the library and in our local bookstore, The Learned Owl. Please, please, if you read one book a year, this is the book you need to read. Gayle, good luck with bringing this story to the screen, as well as Ashley's story to the screen. If the next time you happen to be in Northeast Ohio, Hudson is not far at all from Alliance, and we would love to see you in person. Hopefully there'll be no COVID.
I'd be honored.
And please be careful wherever you land in the world. And we hope that you go on telling women's stories, especially of those women that are involved in passionate conflict for what they feel is the right, just cause. It's a remarkable story that our generation really has to deal with more and more as we unfortunately deal with war. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us. Again, reach out to Gayle. She has a wonderful website, if I recall. And I think that, you can easily search for it on Google. And if you have more direct questions for her or want to correspond with her, I'm sure she'd be happy to do so. And thank you for joining us.